beginning around 1989, was supply chain science. This was taking supply chains, which had existed forever, and applying, applied mathematics, artificial intelligence, computing power, new algorithms, and also in 1989, you had the fall of the Berlin Wall. 1991, you had the collapse of the Soviet Union. 1994 was the real coming out of China. Their economy had started to take off a bit in the 80s, but it was set back in 1989 by Tiananmen Square. It wasn't really until 1994 that they kind of got welcomed back to the party. And then in about 2000, China joined the World Trade Organization. Russia came in a little bit later. But all of a sudden, what I knew when I was a student in the 60s and 70s as an international trading system became globalization. Globalization was kind of a new word in the early 90s because all of a sudden Russia was in the game, China was in the game, the science was more sophisticated, and now the supply chains didn't go from your farm to bakery to grocery store, as I described, but from Chongqing to New York or from Shanghai to Sydney. These were 6, 7, 8, 9,000 mile supply chains with many inputs and many linkages all along the way. And this was all done in the name of efficiency. If you could get the lowest cost labor, the lowest cost inputs, the lowest cost manufacturing, the lowest cost shippers, et cetera, you could drive prices down, beat your competition, and do well by the consumers. And I'll just give a couple examples. Walmart invented a technique, I think it's been around since the Silk Road actually, but they claim to have invented the modern technique of cross-docking. Well, what's cross-docking? Well, it used to be a truck would arrive at a warehouse, they'd unload the goods, put them in certain places. Then another empty truck would pull up and they would pick the goods out and put them on the truck and send it on its way. And Walmart said, well, how about the two trucks arrive about the same time and take the goods right off of one truck and put them on the other, skip the warehouse. Well, they did. And obviously that saves a lot of labor costs and storage costs and a lot of other costs. And in fact, Walmart, they call them big box stores. Well, the reason, Walmart or Home Depot or Lowe's, and the reason they're so big, the store is the warehouse. The store's that big, you don't need a warehouse. All this stuff is right there to a very great extent. So cutting out warehouses, cutting out distribution centers, cross-docking, and a lot of other techniques. So that's a good thing. And it's why we haven't had a lot of inflation prior to last year for a couple of decades. But there were hidden costs. While we were reducing the visible costs, the costs that were easier to understand, we were ringing up hidden costs, and now we're paying the bill. And what do I mean by hidden costs? It's the lack of resilience. It's the lack of robustness. It's that when you have a complex dynamic system that's that highly scaled, that deeply interconnected and that extended, one little thing breaks down and the whole system breaks down around it. We saw that in late 2021 with we had a trans-Pacific traffic jam. I mean, the Port of Los Angeles couldn't unload the trucks, so the container cargoes off the vessels, they were stacked 6 high. They can only go 6 high for safety reasons. The trucks were trying to pick them up. They were lined up. They were waiting for days. The truck gets in. Turns out your container is on the bottom of a pile of 6, so you got to move the other 5 to get to yours, etc. And vessels were sailing down to Baja California and mooring because they're like, why do I want to stand in line or wait in line in the Port of Los Angeles? They got so bad that vessels in Yokohama and Ningbo, which is the port near Shanghai, were not disembarking. They were not embarking, rather. They were like, hey, what's the point of sailing to Los Angeles? There's nothing to do when I get there. So we had this trans-Pacific traffic jam. But that was the end result of a sort of several-year breakdown of the supply chain where we became over-reliant on certain ports, certain vessels, certain transportation lanes, certain inputs. And when one or more of them broke down, the whole system collapsed. I can give you another really concrete example. So take, Germany makes great cars. I've driven Audis for over 30 years. My friends in the United States go, I have a German car, I have a Mercedes. I was like, no, it's Mercedes, but it's made in South Carolina. But the Audis are still made in Bavaria, which is right and proper. But the Germans have very sophisticated, very good engineering and manufacturing techniques. But a car has 1,000 miles of wire, switches and gauges and connections and radios and you name it, an enormous amount of wire. And you can't just sort of throw those wires around the floor of the car on the seats. So you need a conduit. Well, the conduit is a plastic tube. It's, articulated and designed to fit the chassis, but it's basically a plastic tube. Well, but that's the first thing you got to put in, because you got to then run the wires and then, put the doors on the roof and everything else. You can't do that last. Turns out those conduits were made in Ukraine. Well, they got a little war going on, and all of a sudden the conduits weren't arriving. So Germany, here, Volkswagen and Audi had to shut down these multi-billion-dollar assembly lines because they couldn't get one plastic part, but it happened to be the first thing they needed. Well, of course, you call around, you find someone else who can do it, and you get them the molds, but that takes time. Yeah, I mean, war's not a small thing. War's a huge thing, but it affected a small part that shut down assembly lines in Germany. Again, I could give many other examples, but that's where we got to. A lot of people say, well, yeah, of course, the war in Ukraine disrupted the supply chain, or of course, COVID disrupted the supply chain. And both of those things are true. The war in Ukraine continues to ripple through, and COVID continues to ripple through. And those were major disruptions to the supply chain. That is not where it began. It actually started in January 2018 when President Trump launched a trade war with China and put tariffs on imported Chinese goods, specifically solar panels and appliances. Now, these on the face applied to everybody, but China was making most of it. So they were really targeted at China. So all of a sudden, refrigerators, dishwashers, solar modules, there's going to be a tariff involved. Well, and I don't want to debate the tariffs. I actually think maybe that was overdue or needed, but you can argue that both ways. But there's no question that he did it, and that was the beginning of how the supply chain collapsed. So China wasn't going to sit there and take it. So what did they do to retaliate? Well, the two largest soybean producers in the world are the United States and Brazil. The largest soybean importer in the world is China, because they need the food. China wanted to hit us where it hurt, so they immediately shifted all their soybean imports to Brazil. Well, think about the magnitude of that. All of a sudden, the Brazilian farmers, they're going to grow more soybeans. They've got to improve their port facilities. The shippers have to change shipping lanes. You got to move the vessels. Don't go to Los Angeles anymore. Go to, Rio de Janeiro or Buenos Aires or wherever the export point is. Insurance arrangements had to be changed. And none of this happens with a phone call. You can do it over time, but if you're any of those parties, you're a shipper, insurance company, a farmer, port operator, whatever, you don't want a 6-month contract. You want a 5-year contract or a 3-year contract or something that can justify your own expenditures. And they got them. But that was an enormous disruption in and of itself. Now, the U.S. soybean farmers, all of a sudden, they've lost all these orders to ship to China. What do? Well, they call around. Turns out the Netherlands needs soybeans. So we're selling our soybeans to the Netherlands and for distribution in Europe. And same thing. Now you tell your truckers, hey, don't go to Los Angeles, go to Savannah, go to Houston. Enormous disruption to the supply chain over one item, which is shifting soybeans from the United States to Brazil. And anyway, he could give many other examples like that. Here we had a pure case of a study done pre-COVID, and we can see the disruption happening already. So did COVID make it worse? Absolutely. But it started in January 2018.